Yeah, that sounds, just looking at the building and, for academic and like buildings, I'm pretty good at gauging.
I've done concerts there since when I visited, but
All right, I'm going to get out of your hair.
that looks good.
You do look good, love.
Oh,
This shot looks great.
oh yeah, and you're right, the reflection off of the mirror there with the piano and the roses. That's
It's beautiful.
classic. Wonderful. Go ahead and. You're rolling? Okay. Excellent. Well, thank you. Bernard, thank you for doing this. This is a pleasure, to be sure.
it's a pleasure for me, certainly.
Well, let's start at the beginning. I understand you were born in the north of England, at Sheffield, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. When did you start developing a love and attraction for music?
Well, I began piano lessons when I was 5, and then I had made sufficient progress with my first piano teacher that it was deemed necessary that I go to another piano teacher who would take me to a different level. And it's due to that second piano teacher that I'm sitting here talking to you today, because in addition to doing what every piano teacher does along with their students, we learned the repertoire and did the weekly exercises and so on. But unlike any other piano teacher that I've ever known, he obliged me to carry a manuscript book. And at the end of every lesson, he would sit down and he would write in my manuscript book a melody. It might have been a popular melody of the day, it might have been the upper part of a Bach chorale, it might have been anything at all, a tune that he made up. And my task during the week was to harmonize it. No theory, nothing, just using these. And another week he might give me a series or a succession of 10 chords and say, make these into a piece, Bernard. Now, can you imagine what that was like for a 10-year-old? First of all, I had, I think, a natural instinct toward it, but I so enjoyed solving those problems in a sense, almost like children do in other fields. And there were times when I didn't practice as much during the week because I was busy composing. So I have been, in fact, composing in that sense since I was 10.
In listening to your interview with Casey, which was a lot of fun, you talked about being a composer as being a way of life, a way of discovering more about yourself in the process. Could you speak to that?
Yes, there's a sense, obviously, in which it's a profession, being a composer. We, composers of all centuries, like to get paid for their work, and they love to have it exposed in the public so that people can share it and enjoy what we've made for them. But in terms of the work process, it's not just a case of, oh, now I'll do this, or now I'll do that. I think it's an ongoing process, and I think in some ways people find us rather strange, particularly when we seem not to be paying attention to what they're saying or some other event that we're supposed to be participating in, when in fact our minds are probably going through certain musical processes, sorting out some idea that we want to get to when we get into our studio. And so in that sense, it's constantly part of our waking lives. And sometimes during our sleeping lives, as you know, there have been quite famous instances when composers have dreamt about a particular piece of music, and then next morning have gotten up and tried to recreate it as best they could remember from the experience. And I think in any case, in addition to that purely musical, everything that we do in terms of appreciation of life around us and our relationships, the way we think, is all, I think, grist to the mill of being a creative person.
How does your love of poetry and prose inform your work as a composer?
Well, again, I was very lucky because as a young boy, my father, who by normal standards would not have been thought of as being educated, and yet he had an immense knowledge of literature, self-taught, used to read to me every night. not just children's stories, but from time to time he would read poetry that he liked. And although at that age I didn't know what the poetry meant, I loved the sound of his voice. And it was that nuance of sound in his voice as he read poetry that sometimes I would fall asleep, and that would be it. But from a very early age, I loved the idea of language, of literature in general, and then formally studied it when I was a university student and so on.
Did you study in Italy?
I did,
Okay.
yes.
And how did that help?
Well, there's part of me that is, I think, naturally Italianate. I don't know how it comes about, but from the moment that I set foot in Italy for the first time, I felt at home. At that moment, I was not fluent in Italian. I became fluent later by dint of a lot of hard work and spending a lot of time there. But something about, again, the visual aspect of Italy, its architecture, its history, its language, its culture in terms of its cuisine, its habits, and just feeling that, yes, I could be at home here anytime. And ever since, throughout my life, any excuse to go to Italy, I've snatched, and I've gone there immediately to do whatever was required of me.
How do you choose the texts that you use as the framework for your music? There's a lot more out there than you could ever possibly use. So, what appeals to you about a piece or that someone's written that you think, I can see that working as a piece of music?
Well, I think that what we make in terms of music, whether it's a piece for solo piano or for large orchestra or an opera, is often triggered by observation of things other than purely musical. We've just talked about the influence of literature and so on. But I think what we do, we have a mind and a training which tells us whatever is triggered in terms of a musical possibility, we convert that as soon as possible into a purely musical one. Of course, if you're writing a song, then a text is also present. If you're writing an opera, there's also a narrative and a whole scenario and set and so on. But in general, if we're, for example, writing a string quartet, about as abstract as you could possibly get, then it may have started by observing the veins in a leaf, just the structure of something, thinking, gosh, that's one of a kind, I'm fascinated by that. Now what are the possible correlations between that and the possibility for music? Because there's not a one-to-one correlation, obviously, but what there is the mind's imagination looking at one phenomenon and thinking, I could create a parallel to that in an entirely different universe.
How did that relate to what eventually became the Conti trilogy?
I'm sorry?
The Conti trilogy, how did that emerge from that?
The Canti trilogy, which is 3 specific works together as a trilogy, which uses many texts about the moon, about the sun, and about eclipse, came about because, well, in purely practical terms, I was directing an ensemble which had a fantastic soprano vocalist as part of the ensemble, and I decided now is the time that I would write a work for them, that I could teach them to play and conduct and so on. And again, my instincts, I'm a moon person. I don't need to be told where on the calendar the moon is in its phases. I know by my own personality, by my own body. Sometimes it's not so pleasant, but I do respond in that way. And of course, there's a monumental work in the literature by Arnold Schoenberg, Pierre Lunaire, and I suppose, in a sense, and I know for a fact that many of my friends thought, that's a dangerous undertaking when there is such a monumental work of that kind But I've never regarded anything in history as being an object in my path. I much prefer to stand on the shoulders of history and take my own personal leap of faith into what I want to do. And so I began with the Canti Lunatici, which has 13 poems about the moon, about the waxing and the waning of the moon and the full moon, and they're in 5 different languages. And similarly with Canti del Sole, it's somewhat similar pattern, and also with Canti dell'Eclisse.
I remember specifically when you were talking to Casey about the work, and I hope I don't say this wrong, Apocryphos?
Apocryphos.
Apocryphos.
Yeah.
You were talking about, you were a young boy in England, and you saw the newspaper headline that talked about the first, the Allies learning about the concentration camps and the Jews, and that it took you a very long time for that music to evolve, to emerge. I thought that was a wonderful story. How did that piece evolve over the years?
Well, as I've said a moment or two ago, the initial impetus for creation can be from a multitude of sources. In this particular instance, it was a memory from my childhood. My father was Jewish by heritage, lineage, and in 1942, I was 8 years of age. I came home from school and I saw the headline on the newspaper, and it was just at the time when these horrific camps were being discovered, and asked my father, it was something about evil, and I didn't know what that meant. I simply asked him, and he hesitated and said, well, there's something very terrible happening in Europe at the moment, but don't be afraid. But that stayed with me, and of course, because of my father's lineage and mine, then I've pursued that as an interest throughout my life. Read voluminously about the Holocaust from many, many different angles and experiences. And then finally came the opportunity to express my thoughts and feelings when Daniel Barenboim commissioned me to write a work for the Chicago Chorus and Orchestra. Let me just say that in general, I'm not one that can quickly emote to some tragedy or to some experience that I've just been involved in. I think that many of my colleagues are quite capable of doing that, and they do it with all sincerity, and I think very effectively. I can't do that. I could not, for example, after 9/11, have gotten up next day and written a requiem. Much as I felt touched deeply by the whole thing, I can't do that. For me, what I produce as an art and music has to be inside me for a long, long time until it's taken away from its vernacular and its colloquial and everyday meaning into something which I think is ultimately, hopefully, more profound, and I think it's more spiritual.
Who were some of the poets that you used?
Well, I used Paul Celan and Nelly Sachs, but also Heinrich Heine. The piece begins with a poem by Heinrich Heine, who left. They're all by German writers writing in the German language, all of whom were in exile. And Elsie Leske-Schüler, and so there's several. But also the text in English. All the solos are in German, but all of the English chorus parts, all the chorus parts are in English, and they're taken from the Apocrypha, which, as you know, is a book that's not admitted into the biblical canon because it was not felt worthy of being so.
It's a very large, complex work.
Yes. Yeah.
How long did it take to finish?
To write that work? You know, excuse me, can I stop for a second?
Yeah. Here, I'll get it.
Oh,
No problem.
sorry.
No, that's all right.
Getting a little dry.
Sure. I'm having the same problem myself a little bit.
Is the air conditioning on in
Oh,
here?
yes, yeah, it's on.
Oops. Sorry.
That's all right, I may be doing it myself, don't worry.
What was that? What were we?
I think, well, it's a very large, complex work.
It is. It's a big work. It requires a chorus of 180 people, mixed chorus, soprano solo, and a large orchestra. And the performance here, and in fact, it was commissioned in memory of Margaret Hillis, who was the music director of the chorus. She was the choral director of the Chicago chorus for many, many, many years. And Daniel Barenboim wanted to commemorate her and her work, and I felt very touched that he asked me to do it, and that was the way that it came out.
Now, at the time I met you, you were still working on Vincent, and it has since
Correct.
been finished and it's been performed. Tell me about that one, about Vincent van Gogh.
Well, we talked a moment or two ago about composing being a way of life. That particular work, an opera in 2 acts, full length, grand opera, large, in a sense took me 40 years, because I was in Amsterdam in 1973, involved in concerts, and it happened to coincide with the opening of what was then the brand new Van Gogh Museum. His work had always been part of my passion. Again, I was very familiar with a lot of his work, but this opportunity to see the largest collection to that date in one place was really quite moving, more than moving. And I remember standing on the top floor thinking at some point, because I was surrounded by all the drawings in gouache and pencil and crayon and charcoal, and thinking that at some point I'll make it a theatre work, I don't know how or what, but which reflects not only this man's work, but the man who made this work, all of these things. And so thereafter I researched it for many years and had correspondence with potential librettists, which didn't always work out. And there's a history of that in the history of opera. But finally, I got a commission from Indiana University, their huge opera department, to celebrate their 80th anniversary and the 100th anniversary of the music school. And that was a perfect opportunity, because it's probably the largest opera school anywhere, certainly in the States and maybe in the world. And so they have every professional facility that one could imagine in any theatre. Plus the fact that if it were to be for, let's say, the Met or any other opera house, we would have a very limited amount of rehearsal time in which to do it. To be able to do it in a university setting like Indiana, we could take months over preparation. And it showed, because I'm very pleased with the production they did. I'm looking forward, of course, to the first opportunity for the first professional production. But the one that I have so far on DVD is pretty good. And a great credit to that school. They take new work seriously, and they give it as much time as they would give La Boheme and etc.
And in terms of source material, you could glean through the various letters back and forth between Vincent and his brother.
Well, you see on my library shelf there's whole sections of Van Gogh, plus all the letters. Excuse me, good afternoon. Sure. I'm sorry.
Sorry. That's perfect.
Oh dear. Have to get your scissors. Well, now it's digital, of course. Gosh, the number of hours I spent splicing tape in the 1950s.
Oh, I did the same thing. Yeah.
I'm sure you did.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, with the China marker and
Yeah,
the razor
absolutely.
blade. Yeah.
But it was a good test for the ears.
Sure.
That's how good it is to make it work. Yeah.
By the time I did my master's thesis, I had I have 5 or 6 large garbage bags full of tape cuttings,
Yeah.
literally on the floor.
Yeah, wild track.
So as you were saying that you had all of these wonderful letters back and forth between Vincent and his
Yes.
brother Theo to help.
And in fact, J.D. McClatchy, who was the librettist, a wonderful poet, a truly great poet, I believe, and a man of tremendous intellect and imagination, sensitivity. And so the relationship between us was about as ideal as it could be between any composer and a librettist. I mean, it was just a very warm and I think very fruitful and productive relationship. But I handed him, when we began our discussions about the project, all of the research that I'd done and documents and writings that I'd made, and then said, you know, I think the letters are the real source. And he reread them, having read them earlier in his life, went back to them, and in fact they are the focus, the center of. But he came up with something surprising to me, because not only do those letters cover a wide spectrum of his activities in terms of where he was and his relationship with the world at large, and different geographical locations, his state of health, his relationship to his parents, to his brother, but his relationship to God. He was, in a sense, a religious fanatic who was searching for God through his work. And he said, this is why a man paints, to see the world through his eyes. Not our eyes, but his eyes, and then his eyes in relation to his love of God, the spiritual nature of making art for him. It was very special. I mean, he was a man who drank a lot, he womanized, he did all of the sins of the world, but deep down he had this relationship which I think lifts his work to a level that very few have ever accomplished.
That's beautifully put. I remember the first time I stood in front of a Van Gogh at the St. Louis Museum of Art, and I couldn't get over how thick the paint was and how violent the palette knife had applied it.
Yeah.
You could actually see into the painting, and to stand where he had stood in front of the canvas was just an incredible feeling for a kid.
Yeah, to see the work through his mind, not my mind or your mind, but through. And of course, it's what distinguishes the surface of the paintings in so many ways from surfaces of other painters. There's a revelation in almost every brushstroke.
Indeed. What are you working on now?
I'm in between pieces right now, which is not a very long period usually, and hopefully won't be extended in this case. I'm just about to begin. In fact, I've started sketching on a concerto for English horn and orchestra for the wonderful English horn player of the Cleveland Orchestra, and it's a commission from Cleveland Orchestra and Oberlin College, which is celebrating its 150th anniversary in 1516. So that'll be the season, hopefully, when we will do the premiere. So that's, and I just finished another concerto for piano, which was premiered in Boston, commissioned by the Boston Symphony Orchestra for my 80th birthday. That was in April, and we did it there, and then in Germany, and now just last couple of weeks ago in London. And so there's some more coming up.
Now, I've heard that you don't write or you don't work with your wife.
No.
But what is it like to have two composers in the same family?
Well, I tried some alternatives and they didn't work out too well. But this one is as good as it gets. No, we don't work together at all, certainly not in any collaboration. We tend not to discuss with each other what we're working on at the moment. After the pieces have been performed, then we talk about them, and whether or not we think the performance has lived up to what was its potential, or whether there's something in the score itself, in the music, which gave rise to a particularly transcendent moment or a not so successful moment. Then we talk about those things. And I think partly this comes about from the beginning of our relationship because of our age difference, which is 30 years. I didn't in any way I recognized the moment I met Augusta and saw her music and heard her music for the first time. This is an exceptional talent. And I didn't want to be forcing my ways of thinking on her, nor did she invite that. In fact, she was quite candid about it. Leave me alone, I'll get on with my own work. And I don't want anyone saying, I got this because I'm with Bernard Rands. So we have that very separate professional relationship, which serves us well, I think. And in every way, when we're dealing with commissions and the profession at large, we do it as individuals and not as a team.
You're enjoying a wonderful career, and you have so many important works that are out there. What gives you the greatest pleasure about what you do for a living?
Sorry, one more time.
What gives you the greatest personal pleasure from what you do?
The actual process of composition in my studio is the most pleasurable because it tells me more about myself than any other experience I've ever had. By that I mean that every time we go to work, yes, we have ideas, we have fluency, we have experience, we have technique, and yet it's still a challenge because we don't know where it's going, we don't know ultimately how it will turn out. We can only keep working at it until we're able to say, I think it's finished at this point. It's a strange process because no matter how skilled you become and how experienced, I think in all the arts, I think I've heard this from so many colleagues, artists over the years, every time I begin something new, I have no idea what the hell I'm doing. Now, that's obviously not entirely correct, but I know very well what that feeling is. You feel, start this journey again, and it's not quite the same journey, and it's not going to end in the same place. It's going to be a completely new experience. And so that's what gives the most pleasure. I mean, it's agony sometimes, but generally speaking, it's very exhilarating. And not to be immodest for a moment, but this year, since it's my 80th birthday, and I have roughly about 100 performances of my music all over the world, to have all of my creations, not all of them, but a lot of them, paraded in front of my ears, so to speak, over a period of a year, is very humbling and very, very satisfying that I spent 70 years putting little black dots on paper for colleagues to interpret and bring to life, and hopefully for a listener's enjoyment, which is really the basis of the whole undertaking.
Wonderful. I'm coming now to the end of my questions. What was your reaction when you found out that you were going to be honored by the Lincoln Academy? I always ask this one.
Yes, I knew about the Lincoln Academy. I had read about it, as I might read about lots of other things, without any thought that someday, gosh, Augusta and I would be standing there in this wonderful ceremony with a whole history of distinguished people who have been inducted, and indeed on the platform the day we were there, all of these people who in their own particular fields have risen to the top and distinguished themselves. and Mrs. Hillary Clinton, also in the row. What a lovely event it was. And I have to say, there was an atmosphere of elegance and sensitivity and enthusiasm and joy about the whole gathering, which was very moving.
Indeed, indeed. It was a beautiful evening. Beautiful evening. I think I've come to the end of the questions I have. Is there anything I might have left out?
No, I don't. I mean,
Okay. Wonderful. Well, let me get you unwired there.
yeah.